Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Wisconsin Trustee Training Week. This is Jamie Machik with the Nicolet Federated Library System. This is our first session this week. We have 3 others at the same time tomorrow. Tomorrow is Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and you are certainly welcome to register for those if you haven't already. There will be a short survey at the end of today's session, and by short, I mean 3 questions. So if you could, please take a moment and complete that. This feedback is very important and will impact whether we hold future sessions like these geared toward public library trustees. So please do that when the presentation is done. So Sarah Houghton is our presenter today, and she is the director of the San Rafael Public Library in San Rafael, California. So they're a few hours behind us right now. Sarah is an outstanding blogger, presenter, and librarian, and I know you will enjoy hearing her speak this afternoon. So Sarah, whenever you are ready.
Great, thank you, Jamie. As Jamie mentioned in the opening slides, San Rafael Public Library, we're located about a 25-minute drive or so north of San Francisco. We're a town of about 60,000 or so, and we have a library facility that was built in 1907, was remodeled twice, once in 1960 and again in 1970. And since 1970, they've been trying to build a new building unsuccessfully. I took over as director a few years ago and have been furthering that charge toward getting a new building, and as such have learned a lot about facility needs and management and maintenance, and hopefully I can share some of that with you today. If you do have questions, feel free to pop those into the interface at any time, and I'll try to leave some time at the end to answer questions for sure if I don't get to them during the presentation. So I thought we could start off today's presentation with what I consider to be the messy questions about library facilities. And anytime I'm out in the community talking about a need for a new library facility, or talking to my city council, or sometimes even to our library staff, I get 2 questions repeated over and over, and some people ask them very sincerely, and others are kind of poking the bear. So I figured we'd start with poking the bear and just get these messy questions out of the way. The first is the internet taking the place of libraries? And like I said, some people genuinely, legitimately believe that the internet has taken the place of libraries, or inevitably will very soon. Most of the people I find who hold this belief haven't used a library's services any time in the last 20 years or so. So that makes me feel a little bit better because I think that the people who are using libraries recognize that, no, the internet's not taking the place of libraries. I know in our own library, our circulation goes up about 10% every year. Physical materials, our circulation of digital materials goes up about 40% a year, at least right now. I don't think that growth can be sustained. But overall, we're still about 95% physical in-person services, whether it's checking out books or providing research assistance. 95% of our business is still done in those facilities. So I don't think there's any chance of the internet taking the place of libraries. Clearly, the services we offer still hold value for the foreseeable future. The other question I get asked routinely is, okay, let's pretend you're right and we still need library services in the future. Why not just plan a fully virtual library for the future? Why should we be planning for a future facility? And that's an interesting question. There was a library in Texas over the last year, Behar County, Texas, that opened a library facility, but with fully virtual services. So they had no print collections at all. They had digital devices of various sorts. You could check out whatever happened to be available digitally on those devices. And the world's reaction to this, very different model of a library, which was still a library building, let's remember, the world's reaction was very, very mixed, leaning toward negative. And there are a couple of really good reasons for that. One is the digital divide. There are still a lot of people who don't possess these devices on which to access digital information, or more importantly, possess the skills they need in order to access So even if you give them a device, they don't really understand or know what to do with it. So there's a lot of training involved. The second issue that comes up with digitally presented library services is that most of the world's content is still not available digitally. There was a study done in 2011 that showed that the world's information, the total amount of information in the world, everywhere, is now doubling every year, which is incredible. And if you look at things that were created from about 2000 and before, which granted is the vast majority of our history, about 98 to 99% of that is not available digitally in any way, shape, or form. So to say that we can put things completely online, that we don't need a facility, everything can be digital, is, at least in this point in humanity's history, totally false. And as libraries are the purveyors of information services, we need to recognize that there is still this physical plant that we need in our communities in order to provide those information services. And that's to say nothing of all the other things that libraries do, events, story times, literacy training, all of the things that we do. So I believe very firmly we do still need library facilities, and we need good library facilities. So how do you begin to assess what your library is going to need for the future? Where do you even start? Because that can be a very loaded question, a very political question. And my best advice is to look at current limitations and current constraints to service. And if you're a library user of any kind, most likely you can list a handful of those just off the top of your head. The library staff are in a prime position to be able to give you all of the limitations that they face on a daily basis trying to provide service to the community. And so just as a case study, I'm going to show you some of the physical constraints and pressure points that we see in our library. So one of them is, this is our children's room. That's fine, but it's built in a former parking garage because that was the only space available. We couldn't expand it outward anymore, so they enclosed the parking garage and turned it into the children's room. So it's very dark. The ceilings are very low. I can touch the ceilings just by reaching up with my hand, and I'm less than 6 feet tall. It's extremely inflexible as a space. You can't really do anything with the ceiling. You can't really do anything with the walls because it's just solid concrete. No ability to make it look brighter or paint it better. It's extremely limiting. Speaking of parking, this is our library's now parking lot. We have 3 parking spots. We have 2 regular parking spots and 1 parking spot for people with disability. That's it for a town of 60,000. That's a problem. So people often end up parking on the street or biking in, and we get complaints about parking every day. So for us, that's another major pressure point, and I think a constraint to service. We have a lot of people say that they go to other nearby libraries because there are more parking spots, and frankly, I can't blame them. If I had to walk, 2 or 3 blocks to get to the library as opposed to just pulling right up to it, I might make the same choice. Another constraint is just space. This is our book drop, which used to be a coat closet. We have two funnels into the book drop, one from the inside, one from the outside, and it's so tiny that we can't even put 2 receptacles to get the books. So the books get damaged as they land on the floor, and that's an ongoing problem and a costly one. Storage, another issue that I will say most libraries face unless they're brand new and did a good job of planning for storage. The picture on the left is our one storage closet, which is jammed full of anything and everything. And the picture on the right is actually my office. So the director's office has become the de facto storage facility annex as we run out of storage space in the closet. That is definitely an issue. It's a safety issue. We live in earthquake country, so having 7-foot tall stacks of boxes of books probably not the safest thing in the event of the big earthquake hitting us. And then lastly, space, just space. So our collection is only about 1/4 the size it should be as prescribed by the American Library Association because there is no more space left to put books. We have so many books in, the shelves are packed, can't add anything without taking anything away, and there's literally nowhere else to put anything. And so our collection is smaller than it should be for our population. And until we get a bigger facility, there's nothing we can do to fix that other than buying some digital content to supplement it. But as I said before, a lot isn't available digitally, so that only is a partial Band-Aid. So that's one example. So for you, where do you start? And I would like to suggest that we just look at this in kind of two frames, what we need to do and then the factors we need to consider. So the what to do is to begin by projecting out your future population and also your future service needs. And that takes a little bit of crystal ball gazing for the service needs. You don't really know what to predict for library services 50 years from now. That's a bit difficult. But you can probably, with the help of library staff, look out 5 to 10, even 20 years and make some reasonably educated guesses about what kinds of services you're going to need to provide. In terms of projecting population, there are a lot of good tools out there from the Census Bureau, a lot of good demographic studies. Usually your city planners will be able to help you with that to predict the population, either growth or shrinkage. Some cities and towns and counties are seeing a reduction in population. And you want to build your library for the population you're going to have for the next 40 years or so. You don't want to build for exactly what you have today. And I think that's something that's difficult to communicate often to people who may control the political or the money situation in your jurisdiction, is that we're not building for what the people who are alive right now want. We're building for what people over the next 40 years are going to want. So looking at the trends with youth, looking at what schools are doing, looking at what elementary school kids expect from library services is just as important as looking at what the adults of today expect, because those elementary school students are going to be adults well within that time frame and then have kids of their own. So it's very, very important to really look at the full scope of your entire population and where you think it's going. Another factor to consider is the size of your lot, so the entire size of the space that your library is built upon as proportionate to the building size. And in my research, I've been unable to come up with a firm recommendation as to percentage, like your building should only occupy 50% of your lot space or something. There's no real agreement on that. The agreement that is made, though, is that when you're considering your lot size, you should err on the side of bigger. Yes, that's more expensive, but you want to give yourself that room for expansion, because expansion and remodeling is so much cheaper than tearing down a whole building, moving it to a bigger lot, and starting again. And that's the challenge we're facing, is that we're built out. There's no more out to go. So we're having to look at other lots. And so I think for us, as we move forward, definitely choosing a lot that gives us that opportunity for either outward expansion or upward expansion without breaking city codes, which is very important. So oddly enough, in my research, Wisconsin is the leader, and I found that was kind of hilarious since I'd be talking today. There's this lovely public library space needs document. The link is here, and the slides will be available after today, so you can go take a look at it. But there's this really useful way of calculating what your library space needs are going to be. And it's extremely detailed and goes through pages and pages and pages of questionnaires and requires your staff to meet and to talk with the public and to really work together to come up with what this magical formula is. And so as you're looking at types of space, what this formula requests is that you look at these 6 types of library space. And it really is true that library space fits into one of these 6, period. So space for collections, and again, as more things go digital, that may be a flexible space. That may get smaller, it may not. I don't know. But it is one of those numbers that could change. Space for customer seating is second. And as your population grows, you may need more customer seating because you're having more demand of people coming in and wanting to read or study or work together. You need staff workspace. You need meeting rooms. So whether that's a small study room or a large auditorium, some kind of larger meeting space for the public. Then you've got what they call special use space, which can be a whole bunch of things, but it's something that you can kind of define. Like you need a photocopier, you need a book return, you need displays, something that you can name that might change over time in terms of how big it needs to be, but it's a space that will pretty consistently exist in the library. And then lastly, we have non-assignable space. And this is a little more amorphous in my head, so it could be vestibules, furnace rooms, restrooms, things like that. And all of these things in the questionnaire that Jamie nicely provided a link to in the chat, all of these things will add up to the total space that your library will need, which is fabulous. And what you end up with, this is kind of like the final list you get after you work through these, 50 pages or so of questionnaires. You come up with your population, how many different types of physical items you're going to have, and based on the average square feet needed to accommodate that, it comes up to a total percentage and a total square feet. Reader seating space, staff workspace, each one of these things is outlined really clearly in terms of what you need. And it ends up being quite accurate. And this is a really, really good way of figuring out what you're going to need for your population moving forward. So if you look at the very top of this sheet here, it says it's designed for a future population of 17,000. Then if you look all the way at the bottom, it says that the gross area needed is 19,000 some square feet. And that's about the average. The American Libraries Association's recommendation is 1 square foot per resident. So that's kind of the average that they look for in building a new building. I remember this particular case study town only had a current population of 11,000. So for them to be asking for a 19,000 square foot building might look silly until you look at the fact that their future population is estimated to get up to 17,000 in the near future. So I would highly recommend this tool as a very, very good way of figuring out not only if you're looking at a new building project or an expansion, how much square footage you're going to need, but even if you're not at the stage where you're looking at that yet, go ahead and see how your library currently actually measures up to what this tool says you should have. It is pretty widely regarded as the most accurate tool out there, and I would guess that some libraries are going to come out just fine and others are going to come out with a need that's a little bit higher than what you have right now. So we're going to look at 2 top 10 lists for the remainder of the presentation. One is the 10 considerations that I would recommend people in libraries take into consideration when they're looking at either renovations, remodels, or completely new buildings. And the second top 10 list we're going to look at is keywords that the public uses when they're talking about what they want. And there's some overlap between the 2 lists, but where the ideas come from tends to be a little different. So that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of the session. So the first is a first consideration which the library world really recommends looking at for any building is ease of access. So I chose this image intentionally because very recently we had one of our library patrons who constantly forgets his library card and in fact forgets his entire wallet at home. And he said what we should have is outside the library a biometric scanner where we could have people identify themselves by fingerprints and a retina scan, you want to have both, in order for them even to get into the library. And then uses tracking software inside the library to say, okay, there's Steve, he just came in, track him throughout the building, and as he picks up books or other things to check out, magically then checks them out to him as he walks out the door, using RFID or some other technology. That was my one patron's idea of ease of access, which I found interesting. I don't think that's something we're going to be doing anytime soon. But ease of access really is an important element of making your library accessible. The entrance should be visible from the street and very obvious. You shouldn't have any impediments to access for people who are using assistive devices like canes or wheelchairs. You shouldn't have any problems driving up to or parking at the building. There should be easy access using public transportation, using alternative transportation like bicycles or scooters. All of that is really important just to get into the building. And then once you're in the building, everything else should be really easy to access too. You should have great signage that leads people from place to place so that everyone who wants to find the children's room isn't asking at the circulation desk, where the heck is the children's room? It should be obvious. And how to check things out should be obvious. How to get help from a staff member should be obvious. All of this creates an easily accessible scenario for the patrons so that they're having a good experience. The second item is high visibility. So as I stated, as part of ease of access, you really want to be visible from the street. But in addition to that, you want to be visible within the rest of the town as well. So if you're able to put signage up, if you have a multiple floor building and you can put a big sign that just says library, super big at the top, so that from even across town you can see that's where the library is, that's great. If you can work with city planners or permitting departments to put signs up throughout the city or town that says this way to the library with a big arrow, that can be really useful. And that's something that's very traditionally done in Europe, but done a lot less here in the States. I've seen a few towns that do it, but it's not very common. And you also want to have visibility when you come into the library. Again, you want to have that clear signage that directs people from place to place. Adequate parking. So this is one of those factors, again, where there's no real agreement from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, how much parking is required based on your building size, based on your anticipated workload. A lot of it depends on your community. Our community has a lot of people who walk and who bike, I would say about half, and that's not typical in other communities. It may depend on where the library is located. If it's very close to the town center, you're going to have a lot more people using alternative transportation. But if it's kind of far on the outskirts, you're going to have people needing to get there in other ways, by car or by bus. So it's very important when you're considering the location of your building, how much parking is that going to mean that you need? And what is the demographic status of your population in terms of how many of them do use alternative transportation? Figuring out adequate parking is something pretty much you have to do case by case with the planning departments within your city or your county. There's really no magical number I can give you or percentage that I can give you, but it is a very, very important consideration. The fourth factor is convenience, and I couldn't resist this image, although it's totally inappropriate for a library, but drink the beer here, get rid of the beer there. It's right next to each other. And that's super important. And this is not only one of the words that we hear political stakeholders using a lot. The library should be convenient. Getting to the library should be convenient. Checking books out should be convenient. We also hear that a lot from the users themselves. They might use a slightly different word, but it's also a concept that they agree with. Use of the library shouldn't be onerous. It shouldn't be something that requires passing through 5 different doors and going up an elevator before you even see your first book. You shouldn't have to, ask 3 people before you figure out what the right desk is that you should go to get the kind of help you need. There should be a convenience factor for people as they're using the library. Also, where the library is situated is a convenience issue. For us, we're in what's called the cultural corridor of our town, which is very nice. There's a museum next to us. There's an old historical preserved mansion on the other side. City Hall's right next to us. There's a theater next to that. That's great. However, it is not super convenient for much of the town. Our town is in a very hilly area where you've got little enclaves kind of spread out in the valleys, and we're not very centrally located. We're centrally located where the town started. So when it was built back in 1907, but we're not centrally located to where the bulk of the town's population now lives. And so that's something else to consider, is looking at the demographics of where your population is in terms of density, where your service users are currently coming from, how far are people willing to come across town to use your services, and is there possibly a better location for your facility or maybe even for outposts or remote book returns or something, so that you do make the service more convenient for your entire population. Another consideration is access for the younger users in your community. And you might notice that a lot of libraries are built in proximity to schools. Not necessarily right next door, but relatively close. And there's a reason for that. A lot of children, as they get out after school, particularly middle school and high school age, need a place to go after school to work on a project with their peers, to study, to get resources for homework. Particularly now that we see more and more school libraries losing resources and hours, you're seeing that turn back toward public libraries, that we're filling a bulk of that need for our young population. So one of the considerations in building a new library facility or renovating your current one is making sure that you're doing everything you can to make it accessible to the young kids, whether it's where you're located, or what kinds of transportation options are available between the schools and the library, what kinds of programs and after-school services you're offering that could fill those needs for these kids, whether you have space for tutors to come in, whether you have space for kids to work on a project together, whether you've got the right technology to help them do the types of projects they're being asked to do today, which is very different than the stuff I was asked to do in school. And all of those things are important to consider. I think that I am not a children's librarian. I have no background in youth librarianship, but one of the gaps that I see consistently when I hear people talking about library facilities is they never talk about the kids. No one ever mentions, is this friendly for the children? Is this going to work for the kids? There's always an assumption that parents will be accompanying the children, and that's simply not true. And most library staff can attest to that. You get a lot of unaccompanied minors in the library. And while we may have mixed feelings about that, it's a reality of pretty much every public library's life, is that you're going to be dealing with kids on their own. So if you can ensure that they can get to you safely and that you have the services they need, then you've really positioned yourself in your community as having something of value to those children and to their families. Number 6 is views. Now this may be more or less important depending on where you're at, but I would love to use my library again as a really bad example. So this is the view from the parking lot right next to the library. So if I just walk about 20 feet outside of our entrance, this is what we see. It's Mount Tamalpais. It's gorgeous, but our library was not built with this view in mind at all. The only things you can see from our windows, of which there are plenty, you can see a couple of trees, you can see the parking lot, and then you can look across and see City Hall's parking lot. And that's it. Oh no, you can see a funeral home. Sorry, you can see a funeral home, but you cannot see Mount Tamalpais. You cannot see this gorgeous view that's just there for the taking. And so in any renovation or remodeling of a facility as well as building a new one, I would highly suggest that that be taken into consideration. We've kind of seen people move away from this idea of libraries as a very interior space to wanting to be in a place that folds in the outdoors, that actually brings you some of that feeling of spaciousness into your library experience. It makes it much, much more comfortable for people. And not every library is going to have a view of a mountain, but you have a view of something that's better than the view on the other side. And so I think that's the thing I'm asking people to take into consideration is, what do you want to be looking at all day versus what do you not want to be looking at all day? And making sure that both the staff and the public areas are taking advantage of the nature that's around you. Speaking of nature, let's roll into sustainability. Having a discussion about sustainability in our town is pretty much the forefront issue right now. Everything we do has to be green. It has to fit a certain model of sustainability. And building issues of any kind, whether it's what kind of equipment you're using to maintain your heating and air conditioning system versus what the cleaning products are that you're using, down to, are you going to build a green building with solar panels and a live green roof on your new library? All of those questions come into play. And so it's something to take into consideration is not only, how green is it, but how efficient and how sustainable is this building going to be for the next 30 to 50 years, before you're going to do another remodel, before you're going to do another building. I think right now we've got a fair level of voter fatigue across the country in terms of funding public projects, and they want to be certain that their tax dollars are being used really, really well and in a way that fits with their ethics. And more people are kind of turning on to this idea of green buildings and efficiency for lighting and efficiency for heating and cooling. These are all things to take into consideration. Landscaping. These are two of the trees outside our library, a beautiful old oak tree that's estimated to be 200 years old, and then a palm tree which is not native to Northern California, but we have them all over, and it's just weird. But making sure that when you do choose landscaping for your building or are evaluating the landscaping at your current building, that you're really thinking through the long-term effects of these choices. So the oak tree is great. The palm tree is not so great. It's right over our children's patio, and when it was first built, it was a super tiny tree. It was only about 4 feet tall. Now it's about 25, and right over the children's patio is where these giant razor-sharp palm fronds come crashing down when they get dry and start to die out at the bottom of the tree. So we can't use the children's patio anymore because this palm tree is basically a danger or a threat to anyone on that patio. And I don't think that when they first put in this tiny little palm tree, they thought about that. Maybe they didn't think it would live this long. I don't know. But these landscaping choices make a difference. And again, you have to think 40, 50 years down the road and not just what does it look like today. And you're seeing more and more landscape architects doing some really good work around putting in things that are native to your area and drought resistant or flood resistant and things that will work well over the long term. But it is definitely something to keep in mind as you're looking at your building. The ninth factor that stakeholders typically look at is expandability. And we talked about this in terms of lot size versus building size. Is, can you build out? Can you build up in the future if you need to? And I can't overstate the importance of that. Looking at the long-term impacts of the choices you're making is so, so important. Having a beautiful lawn or a garden outside the library is great. If it ever comes to it, could you replace that with a building addition that would allow your library more space? Yes, fabulous. If you have a 100-year-old tree out there, is it going to be harder to replace that and tear it down in order to expand the library? You betcha, because people love trees and they don't like them being torn down. So these are the types of things to look at as you're thinking about expandability. And then lastly, good neighbors. I mentioned we have a funeral home across the street, which we do. This is the funeral home. It's very cute. It's very quaint. And oddly enough, they make a really, really good neighbor for the library. It does not sound intuitive, but they're an excellent neighbor. They get a minimal amount of foot traffic, which is okay. More foot traffic would be better. But the type of foot traffic they're getting is minimally disruptive to us. There's not a lot of competition for parking. And by having a funeral home on one side of the street, a library on the other, and City Hall kind of kitty corner, you've kind of created a little safe triangle in the evening. Nobody is going to be messing around a funeral home building late at night. And likewise with City Hall. And so the library, by having these neighbors, we've kind of ended up in a really nice kind of safe environment. Another library that I used to work at had a liquor store on one side and a tattoo parlor on the other. And I'm all for drinking and getting tattoos, but it does create a really negative environment with foot traffic, especially after hours outside the library. And so this library would constantly have people throwing up on the sidewalk late at night, coming out of the bar, bottles smashed on the ground. Sometimes they would find people passed out next to it in the morning. And that's the type of neighbor. You're never going to have, I hope, somebody stumbling out of the funeral home in the middle of the night and passing out on the library lawn. If you do, that's probably a case to call some record book somewhere. But it's really important to think about your neighbors as they exist now, and then in planning for the future. If you have any sway over the city's permitting or allowing new people to occupy the spots adjacent to the library, it's really important to make sure that the library's voice is heard there so that people understand that who's next to you is a really big deal and does affect your library's sustainability and safety, especially after hours. So now let's turn to the 10 things that we typically hear our customers want. When library users are surveyed about what they want from us, they say a lot of the same things I just covered, but again in slightly different ways. So people will talk about buildings being attractive. They want it to look good inside. They want it to look good outside. I think all of us would agree that's really important. The problem is nobody agrees what that means. No one agrees if the picture on the left looks great or the picture on the right looks great. You're probably going to have about half of the people agree and disagree on anything you choose. With any design project, that's one of the unfortunate realities. And so the best thing that you can do is try to come to some level of community consensus building about what the exterior architecture should look like to keep with what the town's residents want and what the interior should look like or feel like. But I have to be honest, you're going to have a good number of people that are not going to like what you do no matter what it is you do. And that's just the unfortunate reality of design. The second thing is big. Everybody says big. You say, what do you want in a new library? Bigger. What do you want in a new library? Humongous. I want it, 10 times the size it is now. And sometimes that's achievable. In most cases, it's not. So you end up trying to give the sense of space to make it seem larger than it actually is. And there are a lot of architectural tricks you can use to make that happen. Use of glass, certain uses of walkways, lighting, types of shelving to use, flexibility of the space. But that sense of it being big is something that you hear again and again, no matter what community you're in. The third thing you hear is bright. And all of these photos are of libraries, by the way. And this one was particularly interesting to me because to me this looks more like an operating room than it does a library, but it is certainly bright. This is in Taiwan, and Taiwan has some really good libraries. They have a lot of money over there to spend on them, apparently, so they've built these ginormous, hugely vaulted ceilings, and a lot of them bring in a lot of natural light. But again, this is something you hear again and again across communities. People want bright spaces, and I think that part of that is that sense of openness and spaciousness that brightness lends, but part of it is also functional. In libraries, people are doing a lot of reading, whether it's on a screen or on paper. And so having a bright space is almost a necessity just for the type of service we provide. Having libraries that are civic-minded is something that a lot of people will say when you talk to them about what they want. They might use slightly different words. I want it to be very oriented toward our town. I want it to be involved with local politics and issues that are important to the community. But it goes back to that idea of civic-minded. And a lot of the early libraries in this country looked something like this, very grandiose halls, lots of artwork, lots of wood, and a lot of space. And a lot of times there was a fair amount of space dedicated to local collections, local issues, local history. They would have local political leaders come in and give speeches. And you've kind of seen that wane a bit, I would say, over the last 100 years or so. And it seems like there's been a slight resurgence in this desire, not only for this grandiose space that they can be proud of as a member of this community, but also for the desire for the library to be more civically engaged on a governmental level and to bring the local issues into the library and have that be a place for civic engagement. And I think that's something we're going to see continue, particularly with the millennials and the generations following, which right now at least seem to be a lot more civically engaged than Gen X, which I'm a part of, or the boomer generation. There just seems to be more of a desire for that to be central to their lives. And so I think you're going to see that reflected in their requests of what a library should be. The fifth thing is people want things to be customer friendly. So this space may look very inefficient or kind of kitschy, like just it's I don't know, gimmicky almost, like, okay, this doesn't look like a library at all. But if you look at it, it provides a fair amount of very flexible reading and studying and socializing space, while at the same time looking very clean. The lines are clean, it's very bright, and it gives a sense of separation between the different individuals and groups working. And this is one of those things that people ask for over and over again, is that they want to be in a room with other people, but not feel like they're in a room with other people. And that's a challenge. But architecture like this is one way to achieve that, where you have people facing in different directions. You've got kind of delineations of space with the furnishings that break the room up a little bit, but still it's pleasing to the eye, and it's easy to figure out where open seats are for you to be. So customer friendly is definitely something to keep on your radar. Technologically advanced is always top of the list. People always want the latest, greatest technology in their libraries. Many of them cannot afford it themselves, and we are the central, most efficient way to provide that to our communities at large. And so this is a great example. This is a library in the Netherlands, and they have these weird little pod egg chair things, which are great. And they've got the latest iMacs up that you can use from those chairs. And if you look kind of behind and to the left, right behind and to the right, actually, the guy with the red shirt, you see these vertical light pillars. And that's actually the lighting for the room. The only lighting for the room, other than the exterior lighting, is coming from these strange little vertical light poles that kind of grow out of the floor like stalagmites. And that's kind of neat. And this is the technology room and the technology wing. And even though the lights don't actually do anything super functional other than provide light, it fits with that sense of technological advancement, of I'm in the future. I'm living in a room of the future. This is modern design, and this is neat. And people like that feeling. Environmentally sensitive, so we talked about sustainability from the perspective of library stakeholders. If you look at library users, this is how they say it. They say they want something that's environmentally sensitive, whether it's a living roof, as you can see here, at a library in Poland, or whether it's sustainable landscaping or low-flow toilets, you name it. People want something that is going to help the environment. Eighth, flexible, and this is actually one of those words that I would say this is my top word for myself. Because libraries are changing so much today, we need those spaces to be flexible. Traditionally, libraries have been built with unmoving, bolted to the floor, ceiling to floor shelving units, immovable. They're just there. That's what you get. And what you're seeing with probably the last 20 years or so of library architecture is everything moves. Everything is movable. You might have permanent shelving against the walls, but everything that's out on the floor can be picked up and moved at a moment's notice to make space for a program, to put in additional shelving units, to reconfigure it to fit whatever needs are in 50 years. And I think the flexibility of that space is really important and actually plays in with a lot of the other factors we've discussed. Number 9 is efficient. So people often talk about making sure that you're not just sustainable or environmentally friendly, but you're being efficient in the way you're building it. You're efficient with your space. You're efficient with your use of the horizontal and the vertical. And so here is one really good example of that, where you see these stacked floors where they kind of get more and more out as you get lower to the ground, and that allows for the maximum amount of natural light to be coming into these buildings in this particular area, where the light's hitting, they face this a certain way toward the sun intentionally, and it creates a lot of natural light so they don't have to use electricity inside those rooms as much. And that's one of those things that you just say that, our electricity bill is going to get cut in half with this new building. Whether or not that's a significant amount, that's going to make people very excited. And that comes to the last thing, which is cost effectiveness. So in the end, it all comes back to dollars. Your residents, your political stakeholders, your library staff are all going to want to make sure that what you're doing, whether it's renovation or remodeling or a completely new building, is getting you the most bang for the buck. There's not a lot of money to go around, and as you know as well as anybody, libraries constantly have to beg for money to put ourselves on the list along with police and fire and all the other needs that are out there. And when we do get money, we have to make it go a far distance, and we have to make sure we're cost effective. So those are the things that I would say to consider looking at library facility needs for the future. Here are some recommended resources that I found particularly helpful in my own research and looking at planning for new spaces. And I'd be happy to take any questions if you've got them. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And again, I just wanted to remind you that the presentation and Sarah's slides will be available. So if you didn't get everything down or missed something that she said, no worries. You can get that. That will be available to you. Sarah, one question that I had, one of the things that you said customers want, one of the things on your list was the large thing. Can this ever be a disadvantage to staff? I hear of sometimes I hear, especially for our smaller or maybe our more rural libraries, when you have such a big building, they don't have the staff to cover that, or that just can be a problem, or there could be security issues. So how do you deal with those types of things then, if that's something our customers want?
Well, I think kind of the two things that come to mind are, when they say big, they don't necessarily mean big. I think sometimes they mean spacious or spacious feeling. And so that's something that you can achieve without just plain size. But going back to your concerns, that's a very real issue. And we have a public library director here in California who's built, to my knowledge, 25 or so new libraries during her career. And the rule of thumb that she teaches others is that for every floor you add, you have to double the staff.
Okay.
And I didn't really believe that at first.
Wow.
Until I started looking at large, like let's say we have a 20,000 square foot library, that's one floor, and then a 20,000 square foot library, but it's 2 floors. It's about right. That is about right. In order to provide convenient service to people so they're not traipsing up and down the stairs constantly, and also to provide safety and security, both for the staff and for the public, you kind of do have to double staff every floor you add. The ideal layout is one floor that's just ginormous and that has good sight lines that allow you to keep a good eye track on what's going on. So that means no more floor-to-ceiling shelves. That means stopping the shelves at about chest height so that you can see across the library and see what's happening. I think that space issue you can most often kind of deal with the issue of security and safety. You don't want to have little rabbit warrens and nooks and crannies where people can hide and be doing things that you don't want happening in the library and that can be unsafe for the people around them. It's a tricky issue, so I think what we're trying to do is we're looking at our new building needs as really that feeling of spaciousness, whether or not it actually is 10 times the size of our current library.
Great, thank you. Again, if you do have a question for Sarah, you can type it in your question box and we'll relay that to her. Another one that came in, I'm curious as to what she thinks about outdoor space, such as green space, seating, performance, even a playground. Is that getting too far outside of our core competencies? Could there be liability issues?
Questions. Yeah, but good questions. I think that having outdoor space is important. I don't think people like just driving up to a building and walking in and not having some kind of seating outside or landscaping or public artwork, something. People want something outside. Now, how much of that, I don't know. A lot of that is dependent on your local region's climate. Having grown up in Chicago, I know that Wisconsin's much the same as we were, where your outside space is going to be unusable for a good portion of the year. Here in California, our outdoor space is usable for outdoor events without mittens for about 10 and a half months a year. So what I notice out here is we have a lot more libraries with expansive outdoor space, outdoor auditoriums, or I can't think of the word, like performance areas. You've got amphitheaters. You've got a lot more garden space, more seating space. You've got children's programs being conducted on the lawn. I think that all just depends on the efficiency. How much can you use that outside space? In terms of liability, yes, it is absolutely a liability issue. We had to stop holding children's events outdoor on the patio because I mentioned the deadly palm tree. but we also had to stop holding events on the front lawn because we had an incident. Our front lawn is not fenced or gated, and we had an incident where a 3-year-old whose caregiver had actually wandered away to go to the bathroom. The 3-year-old kind of ran out into a driveway and almost got hit by a car. Didn't get hit, thankfully, but after that we were told by our city liability folks that no more, nothing out on the front lawn because we don't want to take on that risk of children being hurt. So it's definitely a liability issue, but I think there are ways to configure the space where it's still usable in a safe way. I mean, a small little gate would probably be enough to make that work.
Great. And on that, with the tree, someone asked if there are, what are the plans with the palm tree causing the liability? Is anything in the works?
No, sadly no. We have a lot of tree preservationists. We actually have a whole webpage on our website devoted to our trees because we get so many questions about them.
Okay.
The local preservationists absolutely do not want to cut the tree down. So we've just relegated that outdoor space as unusable, and in the interest of looking toward a new facility, I've kind of decided not to fight that battle right now.
Okay, great. Another question, any rule of thumb for increasing maintenance costs and or staff? On a recent tour of a larger library, they pointed out that they are having a really hard time keeping it clean with their existing staff.
So you've got routine maintenance, and then you have more periodic maintenance and things that just have a certain life cycle and will break. With routine maintenance, I would say we're also finding it very difficult to keep things adequately clean. We redirected part of our budget actually toward routine daily maintenance and weekly maintenance to make sure that the tables were always clean, that the carpeting got cleaned once a year, that, you know, the stuff wasn't just piling up and being disgusting in the bathroom. The challenge I see more in libraries is usually the lack of planning for long-term failures. So you have a heating and air conditioning system that is 40 years old, and you haven't put aside any money to replace it, and you know darn well you're going to have to, because every year additional components keep breaking, and it just becomes unsustainable at some point. So I think the important question for libraries, aside from the day-to-day, is looking toward those big capital costs that are going to happen at some point. And then when you get something new, say, okay, what is the life cycle of this very expensive whatever it is? And let's backtrack and figure out how much we need to save each year in order to have enough to replace it when the time comes. Because otherwise you end up being forced to close the library completely, which I've seen happen, until you're able to raise the funds to replace it. Or you have to dip into your book funds and not buy any books that year just so you can have a bathroom that works, which is not a choice you ever want to be having to explain to the public. So that, again, it's planning for the long term, planning for the future is essential for library administration and the boards and commissioners to be doing.
Great. One last question. I'm going to kind of put you on the spot a little bit. So whether you are let's say you're a trustee that just joined a library board, or you've been a trustee for many, many years. How would you say that you could best support public libraries right now?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, if we're talking about limiting it to the facility part, how could you best support facilities? I would say ask your library staff to give the entire board a tour of the library, pointing out where the friction points are, pointing out where the pressure points, where the limitations to service are occurring. Most people, even if they use the library, are only aware of the handful of issues that personally impact them. So it's really good to have an overview of what the situation is at hand, and then start working actively to advocate to the local purse string holders, I guess, that this library is inadequate in these ways, and we need this much money and this much attention from you in order to fix it. And as board and commission members, we believe it's very important, so get on it. I will tell you, a single phone call from a board member or a visit to a city council meeting will have 10 times the weight as the library director telling the city council the exact same thing. If a member of a board or commission speaks up, it gives it so much more weight. And if we're talking about what boards and commissioners can do to support libraries in general, I would say, again, use your public voice to make the library visible and heard. Go to City Council and talk about some really neat thing that the library just did, or a wonderful service they just introduced, or a personal story about your use of the library and how it's impacted you or your family. It's really bad when city councils and county boards only see us when we're asking for money or we're unhappy.
Right.
So if we go to them when we are happy and have good stories to tell, that can often do a lot for us when we do come back with our hand out the next time. So yeah, that I guess would be my answer. That was a good question.
Well, great. That was a great response. So we have run out of time. So again, I ask when the presentation ends that you do fill out the short survey. It's only 3 questions. I thank all of you for joining in and participating. And again, I think Sarah, she gave a lot of food for thought in this presentation. I hope many of you are signed up for the other sessions this week. If you are not, you are certainly welcome to register. So again, thank you for listening in. Thank you to Sarah. You will be getting the slides and information sent to you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.